In the hushed corridors of museums across the world, ancient Egyptian reliefs whisper secrets of a land so magnificent, so abundant, that pharaohs spoke of it with reverence bordering on obsession. They called it Ta-Netjer, the land of the gods, a realm where frankincense grew wild upon mountainsides, where gold glittered in riverbeds, where ebony trees stretched toward cloudless skies, and myrrh perfumed the very air that mortals breathed. The Egyptians knew this paradise by another name, one that would echo through millennia, tantalizing archaeologists and historians with its mystery. They called it Punt, and for over 3,000 years, humanity has searched for it, chased its shadow across maps and through ancient texts, only to find that this legendary civilization remains one of Africa's greatest unsolved enigmas. The story begins, not with discovery, but with absence. In the grand narrative of human civilization, certain chapters shine with clarity. Mesopotamia's ziggurats rise from authenticated coordinates, Rome's roads still cut through the European countryside, and the Great Wall of China stands exactly where ancient texts promised it would. But Punt exists in a different realm entirely, suspended between myth and reality, documented extensively yet geographically untethered, a civilization so real that Egypt's most powerful rulers mounted expensive expeditions to reach its shores, yet so elusive that modern technology, satellite imagery, and decades of archaeological investigation have failed to pinpoint its exact location. This is not a story of a forgotten people who left no trace. This is the story of a civilization that left abundant evidence of its existence while somehow concealing the one piece of information that matters most, where on earth it actually stood. The ancient Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, obsessive in their documentation of trade, conquest, and divine favor. Their scribes carved hieroglyphs into temple walls with precision. Their artists rendered the world around them with remarkable accuracy. When they depicted Nubians, the features were distinctly Nubian. When they illustrated Asiatic peoples, the clothing and characteristics matched those populations. Their geographical knowledge, for their time, was sophisticated and reliable. Yet when these same Egyptians described Punt, they created perhaps the most confounding puzzle in archaeological history. They told us what grew there, what could be traded there, how long the journey took, what the villages looked like, even what the Queen of Punt wore, and how her attendants styled their hair. They gave us everything except the ability to find it. The first whispers of Punt emerged from the mists of Egypt's early dynastic period, around 2500 BCE, during the reign of the pharaoh Sahure. Even then, Punt was not being discovered, it was being revisited, suggesting trade relationships that stretched back into prehistory, into eras before written records began their careful accounting of human commerce. These were not exploratory missions into unknown territory. These were established trade routes, familiar paths traveled by merchants who knew the way, who understood the protocols, who had negotiated with Puntite leaders before and would do so again. The very casualness with which early Egyptian texts mention Punt suggests a relationship so normal, so routine, that detailed geographical descriptions seemed unnecessary. Why waste precious space on temple walls explaining how to reach a place that everyone already knew? It would be like modern texts explaining how to find France. The assumption of knowledge would prove, millennia later, to be archaeology's greatest frustration. But Punt was no ordinary trading partner. The goods that flowed from this mysterious land into Egyptian treasuries were the luxuries that defined power in the ancient world. Frankincense and myrrh, the aromatic resins burned in temples and tombs, used in mummification and religious ceremonies, were worth more than their weight in gold. These were not mere commodities. They were the sense of divinity itself, the physical manifestation of the sacred, and Punt supplied them in quantities that no other land could match. Ebony wood, dark and dense and impossibly valuable, arrived in Egyptian workshops to be carved into furniture for pharaohs and staff for priests. Ivory from Punt's elephants, gold from its rivers and mines, exotic animals including leopards, baboons, and giraffes all flowed northward along trade routes that connected this godly land to Egypt's insatiable appetite for the extraordinary. The relationship between Egypt and Punt was more than commercial. In the Egyptian worldview, heavily structured around concepts of cosmic order and divine favor, Punt occupied a special psychological space. It was not merely a foreign land, it was a blessed land, a place where the gods had scattered their favor with unusual generosity. Egyptian texts don't simply mention Punt's wealth, they marvel at it, describe it with language reserved for sacred spaces and divine gifts. This was not the way Egyptians typically discussed their trading partners. Libya, Nubia, Syria, these were lands to be conquered, controlled, or carefully managed. Punt was different. Punt was to be honored, sought after, approached with respect and wonder. The very name Ta-Netja, land of the gods, reveals how Egyptians understood this place. It existed on the boundary between the earthly and the divine, a realm where the natural world produced supernatural abundance. The mystery deepens when we consider what the Egyptians did not say about Punt. They never described it as particularly distant in the way they described truly remote regions. They never portrayed Puntites as dramatically foreign or incomprehensible. The journey was notable but not extraordinarily difficult enough to require royal sponsorship and careful planning, but routine enough that multiple pharaohs across many centuries made the voyage. This suggests a location that was neither impossibly remote nor conveniently close, a journey measured in weeks rather than months or days, a destination that required maritime capability but not suicidal ambition. The Egyptians traveled to Punt by sea, building special ships for the voyage, following coastlines or crossing open water, depending on which route they chose. They returned with their vessels loaded so heavily with Punt's treasures that the relief carvings show the ships riding low in the water, their hulls practically submerged beneath the weight of wealth. In the 15th century before the Common Era, a woman whose ambition matched that of any pharaoh who came before or after decided that Punt's legend required renewal. Hatshepsut, one of ancient Egypt's most successful and controversial rulers, understood power in ways that transcended military might. She knew that legitimacy came not just from conquest, but from connection to the divine, from demonstrating that the gods smiled upon her reign with favor so obvious that even her enemies could not deny it. Hatshepsut faced challenges that male pharaohs never encountered. She ruled in her own right, not as regent or consort, but as pharaoh, complete with false beard and masculine titulary. The conservative priesthood and military elite watched her with skepticism that bordered on hostility. She needed something spectacular, something that would cement her place not just as a ruler, but as one of Egypt's greatest. She needed a punt. The expedition Hatshepsut commissioned in approximately 1470 BCE was not merely a trading mission, it was a propaganda masterpiece, a demonstration of divine favor rendered in wood, gold, frankincense, and living trees. She ordered the journey documented with unprecedented detail, carved into the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, where the limestone cliffs of Thebes rise like natural cathedrals above the Nile's western bank. The reliefs she commissioned are among the most detailed and artistically sophisticated in all of Egyptian art, showing not just the fact of the journey but the experience of it, the wonder of it, the divine approval radiating from every successful transaction and safe passage. These are not simple records. They are narrative masterpieces designed to prove that Hatshepsut's reign brought Egypt into alignment with cosmic order itself. The expedition fleet, as depicted on Deir el-Bahari's walls, consisted of 5 large ships, each designed specifically for the journey to Punt. These were not the simple reed boats used for Nile travel, nor were they the basic coastal vessels employed for short Mediterranean hops. These were sophisticated maritime constructions, ocean-going vessels with deep hulls, substantial cargo capacity, and the structural integrity needed for extended voyaging. The Egyptians were not natural sailors in the way that Phoenicians or later Polynesians were, but they understood enough of maritime engineering to build ships adequate for reaching Punt, which tells us something crucial about the journey's nature. It was challenging enough to require specialized vessels, but not so daunting that it pushed Egyptian technological capabilities beyond their limits. This was an achievable voyage, difficult but not impossible, expensive but not ruinously so. The fleet sailed from an Egyptian port, likely somewhere along the Red Sea coast, though some scholars argue for a Nile departure followed by a portage to the Red Sea. They traveled for weeks, following coastlines or crossing open water, navigating by stars and landmarks, guided by pilots who knew the route or by Puntite sailors who had made the journey before. When they finally arrived in Punt, what they found exceeded even the legendary accounts. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari show a land of distinctive architecture, round, dome-shaped houses built on stilts, elevated above the ground in a style completely unlike Egyptian construction. These buildings sit among trees, suggesting a landscape more verdant than Egypt's desert-dominated terrain, a place where wood was abundant enough to use for construction rather than hoarded as precious cargo. The Puntites themselves, as rendered by Egyptian artists, appear as people of clear African heritage, with features and skin tones that suggest sub-Saharan connections, though not identical to the Nubian peoples the Egyptians knew well. The men are shown with medium brown skin, lean, athletic builds, wearing simple kilts or loin coverings and sporting distinctive pointed beards. The women appear similarly toned, wearing long, wrap-style garments and elaborate jewelry. But one figure dominates the reliefs with such unusual specificity that she has become central to debates about Punt's location. The Queen of Punt, whose name is given as Ati or Eti, shown with her husband King Parahu and their attendants. Queen Ati is depicted with characteristics that have puzzled observers for over a century. She is shown with what appears to be significant steatopygia, an accumulation of fat in the buttocks and thighs, and possible signs of lipedema or other medical conditions affecting her body shape. Egyptian artists were generally careful observers, rendering foreigners with ethnographic accuracy that allows modern scholars to identify populations depicted in ancient art. If they showed Queen Ati this way, it's likely because this is how she actually appeared. The unusual body characteristics have led scholars down various paths of interpretation. Some see in her physique evidence of populations from southern Africa, where steatopygia was more common among certain groups. Others suggest she may have suffered from specific medical conditions. Still others wonder if her depiction was meant to emphasize wealth and abundance in some cultures. Larger body size indicated prosperity and high status. Whatever the explanation, Queen Ati's image has become one of the most analyzed figures in Egyptian art, scrutinized not for artistic merit, but for the geographical clues her appearance might provide. The exchange between Hatshepsut's expedition and the Puntite leadership was generous on both sides, suggesting a relationship built on mutual respect rather than exploitation or intimidation. The Egyptians offered goods that demonstrated their own civilization's sophistication, weapons and tools of bronze, jewelry, strings of beads, and food items. The Puntites, in turn, opened their storehouses and forests. The quantities recorded are staggering. 31 living frankincense trees, complete with their root systems carefully preserved for transplanting in Egypt. Massive quantities of frankincense and myrrh resin. The reliefs show Egyptian sailors measuring it by the sackload, piling it into ships' holds until the vessels groan under the weight. Gold rings counted in the hundreds, ebony and ivory, live animals including baboons, dogs, cattle and leopards. The baboons deserve special attention because their species might offer geographical clues. The reliefs show what appear to be Hamadryas baboons, a species whose historical range is somewhat limited, potentially narrowing the search for Punt to regions where these primates lived. The expedition's success was total. Hatshepsut's ships returned laden with enough exotic goods to supply temple ceremonies for years, enough prestige to silence critics who questioned a woman's right to rule as pharaoh, enough proof of divine favor that the very walls of her temple declared her reign blessed by gods and men alike. The frankincense trees were planted in the terraces of her mortuary temple, a living testament to the journey's success. For a time, the scent of Punt itself perfumed Theban air, as if the land of the gods had been transplanted, however briefly, to Egyptian soil. It was triumph rendered tangible, myth made real, the impossible achieved. And yet, for all the detail carved into Deir el-Bahari's walls, for all the specificity about goods exchanged and people encountered, the reliefs do not answer the one question that modern scholars desperately need resolved. They do not say where Punt was. The search for Punt has consumed archaeological careers, launched academic feuds, and inspired theories ranging from meticulously researched to wildly speculative. It is a search that reveals as much about the searchers as about the searched for, exposing the biases, assumptions, and intellectual limitations of each era of scholarship. In the early days of Egyptology, when Europeans were just beginning to seriously engage with African history, many scholars exhibited a bias that now seems obvious but was then unremarked. They struggled to believe that sub-Saharan Africa could have produced a civilization wealthy and sophisticated enough to be Egypt's favored trading partner. This cognitive dissonance led to some theories that stretched credibility to its breaking point, placing Punt in Arabia, or Mesopotamia, or even India, anywhere but Africa itself, despite the evidence staring them in the face from ancient Egyptian walls. Modern scholarship has corrected many of these biases, but the core mystery remains unsolved because the evidence, while abundant, points in multiple possible directions simultaneously. The case for various locations has been made with varying degrees of persuasiveness, and each theory can marshal significant support from ancient texts, archaeological findings, or logical inference. The hunt for Punt has become one of archaeology's most enduring detective stories, with clues that seem clear until examined closely, at which point they dissolve into ambiguity and contradiction. It is a mystery that rewards careful analysis while punishing premature certainty, a puzzle designed, it sometimes seems, to frustrate resolution. The strongest and most widely accepted theory places Punt somewhere along the Red Sea coast, either in modern Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, or the eastern coast of Sudan. This theory is supported by multiple lines of evidence, each individually compelling and cumulatively persuasive. The journey times recorded in Egyptian texts, a sea voyage of several weeks, fits reasonably well with sailing from Egypt's Red Sea ports to the Horn of Africa. The goods associated with Punt, particularly frankincense and myrrh, point strongly to this region, which was and remains one of the world's primary sources for these aromatic resins. The Egyptians called Punt God's land and consistently approached it from the sea, which aligns with reaching the Somali or Eritrean coast. The architecture depicted at Deir el-Bahari, with houses on stilts, suggests a region where flooding or pest control made elevated construction desirable, consistent with tropical or monsoon-affected coastlines. Archaeological work in Eritrea and Somalia has produced findings that tantalize without quite confirming. Ancient trade goods, pottery fragments and other artifacts suggest long-distance connections between these regions and ancient Egypt. The port of Adulis in modern Eritrea has yielded evidence of ancient maritime trade networks. Somalia's frankincense-producing regions, particularly in the autonomous region of Puntland, whose name deliberately references the ancient land, show signs of ancient settlement and trade activity. In 2010, a team of researchers claimed to have found evidence of ancient Egyptian trade goods in Eritrea's Red Sea coast, suggesting direct contact between Egypt and this region during the Pharaonic period. The evidence is suggestive, pointing toward the Horn of Africa as a strong candidate, but it's not definitive proof that this specific region was the Punt of Egyptian texts. The Somalia-Eritrea theory faces challenges that prevent it from being accepted as definitively proven. Some Egyptian texts describe Punt in ways that seem to suggest a more interior location, not just a coastal strip, but a substantial land with diverse geography. The goods from Punt included not just coastal products, but items like gold and ivory that might indicate access to more extensive territory. The ethnic depictions of Puntites show some features that might indicate populations from further south than the Horn of Africa, though artistic interpretation makes this evidence difficult to use conclusively. And despite decades of searching, no one has found in Somalia or Eritrea the smoking gun, an Egyptian inscription that explicitly identifies the location as Punt, or a Puntite inscription that confirms the connection, or archaeological remains so distinctively Egyptian and so precisely dated that the link becomes undeniable. A second major theory places Punt in southern Arabia, particularly in modern Yemen. This theory has lost favor in recent decades, but retains some scholarly support because it too can marshal significant evidence. Yemen, like the Horn of Africa, produces frankincense and myrrh. The sea journey from Egypt to Yemen's coast is achievable and fits the time frames suggested in Egyptian texts. Some depictions of Puntites show clothing and architectural styles that might match Arabian rather than African traditions. The biblical land of Sheba, associated with the famous Queen of Sheba who visited King Solomon, was located in Yemen, and some scholars have suggested possible connections between Sheba and Punt, though the chronological gaps make direct equations impossible. The Arabian theory's main weakness is that it requires explaining why Egyptians would treat an Arabian location as quite so exotic and divine. Given that they had extensive contact with Asiatic peoples and regularly campaigned in that direction, Arabia was part of Egypt's known world. Would they really grant it the mystical status they accorded to Punt? More exotic theories have been proposed over the years, each with some intriguing supporting evidence, but ultimately unable to overcome the weight of argument against them. Some scholars have suggested Punt lay much further south, in modern Kenya, Tanzania, or even Mozambique or Zimbabwe. These theories emphasize the African features of Puntite depictions and the exotic animals like giraffes that could have come from East African savannas. They point to the gold trade networks that extended throughout eastern and southern Africa in later periods and suggest that similar networks might have existed in pharaonic times. The difficulty with far southern theories is the journey length. Reaching sub-equatorial Africa from Egypt by sea would have required maritime capabilities and travel times that seem to exceed what Egyptian texts suggest. The Egyptians described the Punt journey as significant but achievable. Reaching Mozambique would have been genuinely epic, likely requiring months at sea and levels of navigation expertise that Egyptian sailors probably didn't possess. A few scholars have proposed that Punt might not have been a single fixed location at all, but rather a shifting designation that referenced different regions at different times across Egypt's 3,000-year history. This theory suggests that Punt was less a specific place name and more a generic term for the exotic lands to the south and east where valuable trade goods originated. In some periods, Punt might have meant Somalia. In others, it might have referred to regions of Arabia or the East African coast further south. This would explain why evidence seems to point in multiple directions because, in fact, it did point in multiple directions across different centuries. The weakness of this theory is that it requires explaining why Egyptians, who were generally precise in their geographical terminology, would use a single name so loosely, and why their descriptions of Punt show such consistency across different time periods if they were actually describing different places. The mystery of Punt is complicated further by the question of what happened to it. Egyptian texts mentioning Punt become less frequent and eventually cease entirely in later periods of Egyptian history. After the 20th dynasty, around 1070 BCE, references to Punt largely disappeared from Egyptian records. Perhaps the trade routes to Punt were disrupted by political instability or climate change. Perhaps Punt itself collapsed or was conquered by other powers. Perhaps the name fell out of use while trade with the same regions continued under different designations. Or perhaps the absence of references reflects more the decline of Egyptian power and record-keeping than any change in Punt's status. Egypt's New Kingdom period, when Punt references are most common, was also Egypt's imperial height. As Egyptian power waned, so did their ability to mount expensive foreign expeditions and their interest in documenting them in temple inscriptions. Climate research has added another dimension to the search for punt. Studies of ancient climate patterns have revealed that the regions around the Red Sea and Horn of Africa experienced significant environmental changes during the periods of Egyptian history. Areas that are now quite arid were once more humid, supporting more extensive vegetation and wildlife. This means that the physical geography of potential punt locations would have looked different 3,000 years ago than it does today. A region that now seems too barren to match Egyptian descriptions of punt's abundance might have been genuinely verdant in antiquity. This complicates the search, because we can't simply visit modern Somalia or Eritrea and ask, does this match the ancient descriptions? We have to imagine these landscapes as they were millennia ago, covered with vegetation that has since vanished, supporting ecosystems that have since collapsed, possessing natural resources that have since been exhausted. Genetic studies of baboons have provided one of the more creative approaches to locating punt. Researchers have analyzed the DNA of mummified baboons found in Egypt, comparing it to modern baboon populations across Africa and Arabia. The logic is straightforward. If we can determine where Egypt's imported baboons came from, we might identify trade connections that could lead us to punt. Initial results have been intriguing, with some mummified baboons showing genetic links to baboon populations in Eritrea and Somalia, supporting the Horn of Africa theory. However, the research is complicated by the fact that baboons might have been traded through multiple intermediaries, meaning their ultimate origin might be different from their immediate source, and by the reality that baboon populations and their ranges have changed significantly over millennia. Still, this genetic approach represents the kind of creative, multidisciplinary investigation that modern technology makes possible, and that might eventually solve puzzles that traditional archaeology alone cannot crack. The search for punt has also been hampered by the political and practical difficulties of conducting archaeology in the most likely candidate regions. Somalia has endured decades of civil conflict that made systematic archaeological work nearly impossible. Eritrea has been politically isolated and archaeologically underexplored. Sudan has undergone multiple periods of instability. Yemen has been devastated by the recent civil war. These are not easy places to mount the kind of extensive, long-term archaeological campaigns that would be necessary to definitively locate ancient trading centers and trace their connections to Egypt. The sites that might hold the answers to punt's location exist in regions where digging for ancient artifacts often takes a back seat to survival, where cultural heritage protection is a luxury that struggling governments cannot always afford, and where the international archaeological community has had limited access for decades. Punt's mystery persists, partly because we simply haven't been able to look properly in the places where answers most likely lie. Yet the search continues, driven by archaeology's fundamental optimism, the belief that evidence, properly sought and correctly interpreted, can answer even the most stubborn questions. New technologies offer hope. Satellite imagery can identify ancient settlement patterns and trade routes from space. Ground-penetrating radar can locate buried structures without excavation. Isotope analysis of Egyptian artifacts can trace the geographical origin of wood, stone, and metal. DNA analysis can identify the source populations of ancient organic materials. Each year brings refinements to these techniques, increases in their sensitivity and specificity, improvements in our ability to extract information from partial evidence and degraded materials. The tools that failed to locate punt in the 20th century are not the tools available in the 21st, and the tools we'll have in the 22nd century may make today's technology seem primitive. Perhaps most importantly, the search for punt benefits from a gradually improving understanding of ancient African history in its own right, rather than merely as an appendix to Mediterranean or Near Eastern history. For too long, African archaeology was underfunded, understudied, and distorted by colonial prejudices that assumed African civilizations were derivative of external influences rather than indigenous developments. That bias has diminished, though not disappeared, and as it continues to fade, as African archaeology receives the resources and scholarly attention it deserves, As African scholars increasingly lead the investigation of their own continental history, the chances improve that Punt's location will finally be confirmed. Punt was an African civilization, and it will likely be through a fuller understanding of African history, its trade networks, its political structures, its environmental context, that we finally pin down where it stood. The question arises, why does Punt matter? Why devote such energy to locating one ancient trading partner among many that ancient Egypt maintained? The answer reveals something important about how history works and what we lose when civilizations vanish without trace. Punt matters because it represents a sophisticated African civilization that existed outside the narrative structures we've imposed on ancient history. It was not part of Egypt, not colonized by Rome, not conquered by the Islamic caliphates, not incorporated into the Ethiopian highlands kingdoms. It existed in its own right, wealthy and powerful enough that the greatest empire of its time sought its friendship and trade, respected it enough to approach it with honor rather than conquest. The existence of Punt challenges simplified narratives about ancient Africa, disrupts comfortable stories about who had civilization and who didn't, who possessed wealth and who served merely as resource extraction zones. When ancient texts speak of Punt, they describe a place of agency, not passivity. The Puntites were not merely sources of raw materials waiting to be exploited, they were active participants in trade networks, skilled negotiators who clearly set their own terms and maintained their independence even when dealing with a superpower like Egypt. The Queen of Punt received Hatshepsut's expedition as an equal treating with an equal, not as a tributary welcoming overlords. The exchange of goods was reciprocal, not extractive. This image of ancient African civilizations as complex, sophisticated, and powerful conflicts with colonial-era narratives that portrayed pre-colonial Africa as primitive and passive, waiting to be brought into history by outside forces. Finding Punt, confirming its location and studying its material culture would provide physical proof of what the texts already tell us, that ancient Africa possessed multiple centers of civilization, multiple models of political organization, multiple sources of wealth and power. The mystery of Punt also illustrates the contingency of historical memory. We know about Punt only because Egypt was obsessed with it and documented that obsession extensively. But Punt itself left no written records that we've yet found, built no monumental architecture that obviously survives, created no artistic traditions that we can definitively identify. Either the Puntites didn't create these things, or they created them in materials and forms that haven't survived 3 millennia, or we've found them but don't recognize them as Puntite because we don't know what Puntite culture looked like independent of Egyptian descriptions. This is history's cruelty: civilizations that don't write extensively in durable materials, that don't build in stone, that don't leave obvious markers, can vanish almost completely, surviving only in references written by others, understood only through the distorting lens of foreign observers who described what interested them while ignoring what seemed mundane. How many other Punts are out there? Civilizations that thrived in antiquity, that built complex societies and participated in long-distance trade, that accumulated wealth and developed distinctive cultures, but that left too little material evidence, or evidence we don't know how to recognize, and so exist now only as blank spaces in our historical maps. The mystery of Punt reminds us that our knowledge of ancient history is fragmentary at best, that vast regions of human experience have vanished, leaving barely a trace, that the civilizations we know about are likely just the fraction that happen to leave evidence we can recognize and interpret. It is a humbling thought for a species that believes it has decoded its past, that thinks it knows the major plot points of human history. Punt suggests we might be missing whole chapters, entire civilizations whose stories would change our understanding of how human societies developed if only we could recover them. There is melancholy in Punt's absence, a sense of loss that goes beyond simple scholarly frustration at an unsolved puzzle. Somewhere along the coast of Africa or Arabia, perhaps beneath modern cities or agricultural fields, perhaps in regions too unstable or remote for archaeological investigation, the physical remains of Punt likely still exist. Foundation stones of buildings where frankincense merchants conducted their business, harbour facilities where Egyptian ships unloaded bronze goods and loaded aromatic resins, elite burials of Puntite nobility, perhaps including Queen Ati herself, interred with grave goods that would confirm their identity and illuminate their culture. Trash heaps filled with pottery and food, remains that would reveal daily life. Temple sites where Puntite gods received worship. All of this probably still exists, waiting, containing answers to questions that archaeologists have asked for over a century. But we can't reach it, can't locate it, can't tease out its secrets. The past is there, tantalizingly close, separated from us not by vast distances of time, so much as by thin layers of earth and our inability to identify exactly where to dig. Yet there is also hope in Punt's persistence. The mystery has survived because the evidence has survived, because Egyptian scribes carved their testimonies into stone that would endure millennia, because ancient artisans created reliefs of such quality that we can still examine them today and extract new information from details that previous generations overlooked. Every generation of scholars approaches Punt with new tools, new methodologies, new perspectives, and extracts fresh insights from evidence that has existed all along but can be read differently with different questions and technologies. The relief of Queen Ati has been studied for over a century, but only modern medical knowledge allows us to potentially identify specific conditions that might have affected her and that might provide clues about population genetics and geographical distribution. The frankincense mentioned in Egyptian texts has been known since those texts were first translated, but only modern chemical analysis of ancient resin residues can potentially trace them to specific source regions based on chemical signatures. The Land of Punt occupies a unique space in human imagination. It is simultaneously historical fact and tantalizingly mystery, thoroughly documented yet geographically lost, so well known to the ancients that they barely bothered to explain it, so obscure to modernity that we've searched for it without success for over 100 years. It is the civilization that got away, the culture that slipped through history's fingers, the place that should have been remembered but somehow wasn't quite thorough enough. In a way, Punt represents all the lost civilizations of Africa and the world, all the societies that thrived and then vanished, leaving only echoes, all the human achievements that didn't quite make it into the permanent record, and now exist only in fragments, tantalizing and incomplete. The ancient Egyptians believed that to be forgotten was a kind of death, that memory was the key to immortality, that as long as someone spoke your name and remembered your deeds, you continued to exist in some meaningful sense. By this standard, Punt has achieved a strange kind of immortality. For 3,000 years and counting, people have spoken of the land of the gods, have wondered at its wealth, have sought its location, have kept its memory alive, even as the physical place itself remains hidden. Hatshepsut, in commissioning those elaborate reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, ensured that Punt would never be entirely forgotten, that some record of its existence would survive as long as those temple walls stand. She gave Punt a kind of immortality through documentation, even if the civilization itself has vanished. The irony is that her meticulous record-keeping preserved everything except what we most need to know. As we stand in the present moment, the search for Punt continues in archaeology departments, in journal articles debating fine points of ancient geography, in laboratories where isotopes are measured and DNA is sequenced, in satellite images scanned for anomalies that might indicate ancient settlement patterns. It continues in the field when conditions allow, when archaeologists can access the most promising regions and conduct systematic surveys. The mystery persists, but so does the investigation, driven by the fundamental human need to know, to complete the picture, to solve the puzzle. Each piece of evidence adds something to our understanding, even if it doesn't provide definitive answers. Each theory refined, each hypothesis tested, each dead end explored, narrows the possibilities and brings us incrementally closer to truth. Somewhere, the truth waits. The physical reality of Punt exists. We know this with certainty because the ancient Egyptians went there, traded there, and described it in detail. It was a real place, not a myth, not a confused misunderstanding, not an amalgamation of multiple locations. It was a specific region with specific geography, specific people, specific culture. The Egyptian records, for all their frustrating geographical vagueness, are too detailed and too consistent to represent anything other than direct observation of a real place. Hatshepsut's artists drew what they saw, or drew what was described to them by people who had seen. Queen Ati was a real person, ruling a real kingdom, engaging in real diplomatic and commercial exchanges with Egypt's female pharaoh. The incense trees planted at Deir el-Bahari were real plants, taken from real groves in Punt's real forests. The truth exists. We simply haven't yet managed to definitively identify it. Perhaps what makes Punt's mystery so enduring is that it reminds us how much we don't know, how much of history remains unrecovered, and how tentative our understanding of the ancient world truly is. We can build pyramids in virtual reality. We can read papyri with X-ray technology. We can reconstruct ancient faces from 3,000-year-old mummies. But we still can't definitively locate a major trading civilization that Egypt interacted with for over 1,000 years. It is a humbling mystery, a reminder that for all our technology and all our scholarship, the past keeps some secrets very well. It reminds us that history is not a complete story that we've simply memorized. It is a puzzle with missing pieces, a narrative with gaps, a picture partially obscured by time's relentless erosion of evidence. The ancient Egyptians would perhaps find our confusion puzzling. To them, Punt was as real and as well known as any neighboring land. The journey was familiar, the route established, the destination clear. They no more needed to provide detailed directions to Punt than a modern text needs to provide detailed directions to major world cities. The assumption that knowledge would persist proved false, as it so often does when civilizations fall and languages die and traditions fade. What seemed permanent to the ancients, the knowledge of where Punt lay, how to reach it, what its people were like, turned out to be fragile, preserved only imperfectly in stone reliefs and papyrus texts. Transmitted across millennia, in forms that lost crucial context and detail along the way. The Egyptians preserved the what and the why of Punt, but somehow the where slipped away, lost in the vast gap between ancient understanding and modern confusion. And so the search continues, patient and persistent, driven by curiosity and scholarly stubbornness, and the simple human refusal to accept that some questions cannot be answered. New expeditions are planned, new surveys designed, new technologies developed. Archaeologists compare notes, historians refine theories, geneticists trace connections, climate scientists reconstruct ancient environments. The scattered community of scholars who care about Punt continues its work, knowing that the answer might come tomorrow or might take decades more, but convinced that eventually, somehow, the pieces will align. Someone will dig in the right place, or analyze the right artifact, or make the right connection between disparate pieces of evidence, and suddenly what has been obscure for 3,000 years will become clear. When that moment comes, when we finally confirm Punt's location beyond reasonable doubt, it will be more than an archaeological triumph. It will be the recovery of a lost African civilization, the restoration of a blank space on our historical maps, the return to memory of a people who thrived in antiquity and then somehow faded from recall. It will be proof that persistence pays off, that careful scholarship eventually wins out, that even the most stubborn historical mysteries can yield to patient investigation. And it will be, perhaps, most importantly, a reminder that history is not fixed and complete, but constantly being revised and expanded as new evidence emerges and old questions finally receive their answers. Somewhere in East Africa or the Arabian Peninsula, beneath soil or sand or modern construction, the land of the gods, waits to be found. The ancient frankincense trees that Hatshepsut transplanted to her temple have long since died, their exotic perfume faded from Egyptian air. The ships that carried Punt's wealth to Thebes rotted to nothing millennia ago. The merchants who negotiated prices in Puntite markets and the sailors who navigated Egyptian vessels to Punt's harbors have returned to dust. Queen Ati and King Parahu, if they ever had tombs, rest in them still, perhaps beneath layers of later occupation, perhaps in locations we've searched without recognizing what we found. The civilization they ruled, the culture they maintained, the society they governed, all of it has vanished into time's consuming maw, leaving only traces so faint that we can barely follow them. But the traces exist, the story survives, the mystery endures. And as long as it endures, so too does the chance that we will solve it, that the land of the gods will finally reveal where it has been hiding all along, that Punt will step out of legend and back into history where it belongs. The desert wind that blows across Egypt today might carry grains of sand from Punt's ancient shores. The incense that burns in churches and temples worldwide might descend from plants whose ancestors grew wild in Punt's mountains. The gold that glitters in museums might include atoms that once passed through Puntite merchants' hands. In ways both metaphorical and potentially literal, Punt is still with us, woven into the fabric of history and culture, present even in its absence, remembered even in its loss. It waits not just to be found geographically, but to be restored to its rightful place in human history, not as a footnote, not as a mystery, but as what it was, a great civilization, an African power, a land so blessed that Egypt's mightiest rulers sailed for weeks to reach it and considered the journey worthwhile. The land of the gods is out there still. We simply need to remember how to see it.